She was just 16 years old, a girl who loved drawing butterflies in her notebook, who saved the last slice of cake for her mother, who still believed, with everything inside her, that her family was finally safe. But the man sleeping down the hall, the man her mother called her husband, the man Emily had been told to call her stepfather, was living a secret so dark, so calculated, so cruel, that by the time the truth came out, it would shatter everything they had ever known. This is not a story that is easy to tell, but it is a story that needs to be heard.
Before we begin, let me know in the comment where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and your support helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.
What started as a blended family trying to build a new life, slowly, quietly, turned into a nightmare that no one on the outside could have imagined. The neighbors saw birthday decorations on the porch. The school saw a polite girl who made good grades. The church saw a smiling couple who sat in the third row every Sunday. Nobody saw what was happening behind the closed doors of that house on Maple Creek Drive. Nobody, that is, except Emily, and she couldn't tell a soul. By the time this story ends, and I want you to stay until the very last second, you will understand why she stayed silent for as long as she did. And maybe, just maybe, you'll never look at a quiet child the same way again. Her mother, Sandra Carter, had raised Emily alone for almost 9 years after Emily's biological father walked out when Emily was just 7. Sandra worked double shifts at a dental office during the week and waitressed on weekends. She drove a car with a cracked dashboard and a heating system that only worked on one side. She clicked coupons, she stretched groceries. She made sure Emily's school uniforms were always ironed and that there was always something warm for dinner, even if that something was just canned soup with buttered bread. Sandra was not a woman who complained. She carried her hardship quietly, the way so many single mothers do, with a kind of stubborn grace that the people who love them rarely fully appreciate until much later.
Emily saw all of it. She saw her mother fall asleep at the kitchen table with bills spread out in front of her. She saw her cry quietly in the bathroom, thinking Emily couldn't hear. She saw her mother's shoes, worn so thin you could feel the ground through the soles. And from a very young age, Emily made a private promise to herself that one day things would be different, that one day she would make her mother proud, that one day they wouldn't have to be afraid of what was coming next. Emily was 13 when Kelvin Harris walked into their lives, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed like maybe that day had finally arrived.
Kelvin Harris was 41 years old when he met Sandra at a church community dinner in the spring. He was handsome in a steady, dependable sort of way. Broad shoulders, a calm voice, always the first to offer to carry someone's groceries or fix something that was broken. He drove a clean truck. He had a steady job as a facilities manager at a local hospital. He brought flowers to the third date and paid for the check without making it a show. Sandra hadn't been on a date in 4 years. She was cautious at first, the way any woman who had been left before learns to be cautious. But Kelvin was patient. He didn't rush her. He showed up when he said he would. He called when he said he'd call. And after 6 months of careful, measured courtship, Sandra allowed herself to believe that this time might be different.
Emily was guarded when she first met him. She shook his hand politely and answered his questions in short, careful sentences. But Kelvin seemed to understand that trust had to be earned. He didn't try to be her father. He didn't overstep. He brought her a book about wildlife photography the second time he visited. She had mentioned once, casually.
They got married on a Saturday in October. It was a small ceremony, just family and close friends. A white arch decorated with real roses, and a cake Sandra had found at a discount bakery that tasted better than anything from a fancy shop. Emily wore a pale blue dress and held a small bouquet of daisies. In the photographs from that day, she is smiling, a real smile, not a polite one. She is standing between her mother and Kelvin, and her eyes are bright. They moved into Kelvin's house on Maple Creek Drive 3 weeks later. It had a backyard. It had a guest room that became Emily's room. It had a porch swing where Sandra liked to drink her coffee in the mornings.
From the outside, everything looked exactly the way they had hoped it would look. And for a while, just a while, that is almost how it felt.
It started so small that Emily almost convinced herself she was imagining it. 3 months after the move to Maple Creek Drive, Kelvin began setting rules. Not unreasonable ones at first: a curfew, expectations about chores, reminders to call if plans changed. Emily followed them without complaint. She understood that blended families required adjustment. She had read about it. She told herself this was just the growing pains of a new household finding its rhythm. But by the 5th month, the rules had multiplied in ways that felt less like structure and more like walls. She was no longer allowed to have friends over without 48 hours notice. She had to tell Kelvin, not her mother, Kelvin, her schedule every morning before school. She was not to be in any room of the house with the door fully closed unless she was sleeping or using the bathroom. At first, these rules were explained away as safety measures or just how things work in this house. But the explanations started feeling thin.
Then came what Emily later described as the watching. It was the way Kelvin looked at her sometimes. Not the way a step-parent looks at a child, but something else. Something that made the back of her neck feel cold. He would linger in the hallway outside the bathroom after she had gone in to shower. He would find reasons to be in whatever room she was in. He would comment on her appearance in ways that felt slightly off. Not inappropriate enough for her to point to and say that was wrong, but just enough to leave her feeling unsettled. She started changing her routine. She changed clothes more quickly. She started leaving the television on louder so she could hear footsteps approaching. She began carrying her phone everywhere. These were not decisions she made consciously at first. They were the small, instinctive adjustments that a person's body begins to make when it senses danger before the mind has fully named it. Emily noticed that Kelvin also started finding reasons to be alone with her. Sandra worked late on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Before, Kelvin would use those evenings to catch up on work or watch TV. Now, he started suggesting things, asking if she wanted to watch a movie, offering to help her with homework, asking her to come help him with something in the garage. Emily began manufacturing reasons to avoid being alone with him. She joined the after-school art club specifically because it met on Thursday afternoons. She called a classmate named Destiny to come over on Tuesday evenings because she knew Kelvin wouldn't behave the same way in front of another person. She started spending more time on the porch where neighbors might see her. None of this did she explain to her mother. Because how do you explain a feeling? How do you put into words the specific texture of a fear that hasn't fully happened yet? She kept telling herself she was overreacting. She kept telling herself that Kelvin was just awkward, just socially strange, just trying too hard. She kept telling herself that the feeling would go away. It didn't. Sandra noticed that Emily had grown quieter, but she attributed it to the typical emotional turbulence of a teenager adjusting to a new home. She asked Emily once, gently, if everything was okay. Emily said yes. She looked her mother in the eye and said yes, because the alternative, watching her mother's face collapse with fear and guilt, felt worse than whatever she was carrying alone. Emily was 14 by this point. She was carrying more weight than any 14-year-old should ever have to carry, and the worst of it had not yet begun. It was a Thursday evening in February. Sandra was working a late shift. Emily had made herself a bowl of cereal and was sitting at the kitchen table finishing a history assignment when she heard Kelvin's footsteps on the stairs. She remembers the sound of each step. She remembers the specific creak of the third stair from the bottom. She remembers looking at the clock on the microwave, 9:47 p.m. She remembers every detail of that night with the kind of clarity that trauma burns into memory. She would tell investigators later that it was as if her mind had known, even before the door opened, that this moment would divide her life into before and after. What Kelvin did that night, what he did to a 14-year-old girl who was trying to finish her history homework, who had a bowl of cereal going soggy in front of her, who still had a poster of a golden retriever on her bedroom wall, I will not describe in graphic detail because Emily's pain is not content. But I will say this. He crossed a line that night that cannot be uncrossed. He violated a trust that she had taken a year to build. He took something from her that she could never get back. And when it was over, he looked at her calmly, without remorse, and he said, "This doesn't leave this house." Then he went upstairs. Emily sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, staring at the clock on the microwave, watching the minutes tick forward, trying to understand what had just happened to her, trying to understand how the world outside the window could look exactly the same streetlights, the same quiet street, the same neighbor's dog barking in the distance, when everything inside that house had just completely fallen apart. She went to bed before her mother came home. She lay very still in the dark, facing the wall, listening to the sounds of Sandra moving quietly through the house, the water running in the kitchen sink, the television going on low, the soft creak of the hallway floor. She wanted more than anything to get up and go to her mother. She wanted to tell her. She wanted to feel her mother's arms around her and hear her voice saying that it would be okay. But another part of her, a quieter, more terrified part, kept asking, what if she doesn't believe me? What if she thinks I did something wrong? What if I break her? What if Kelvin takes everything away from her? What if she loses the house? What if she ends up working double shifts again, crying at the kitchen table, wearing shoes with holes in the soles? Emily thought about all of that in the dark, and she stayed quiet. That decision, the decision to stay quiet, would cost her more than she could have imagined. The next morning, Kelvin made pancakes. He poured orange juice. He asked Emily how she slept and handed her a plate without meeting her eyes. Sandra sat at the table in her robe reading something on her phone, unaware. The scene was so ordinary, so unbearably ordinary, that Emily felt something inside her go very still and very cold. She ate the pancakes. She went to school. She sat in her first period class and stared at the board, and she thought, nobody in this room knows. Nobody can tell. And she understood, for the first time, the particular loneliness of a secret that you cannot share with anyone.
In the days that followed, Kelvin did something that investigators and child psychologists who later reviewed this case described as textbook abuser behavior. He didn't threaten Emily loudly. He didn't warn her with anger. He did something far more effective than that. He was kind to her. He was considerate. He asked about her day. He complimented her artwork. He helped her carry groceries in from the car. And quietly, in moments when Sandra wasn't nearby, he would say things in a soft voice, almost conversationally, like, "Your mom has been through so much. She finally has stability. I'd hate for anything to disrupt that." Or, "You and I understand each other, don't we, Emily? We both just want Sandra to be happy." He never said, "Don't tell." He didn't need to. The message was delivered in much subtler ways, wrapped in the language of love and protection, and it was devastatingly effective. Emily understood exactly what he meant, and she carried it.
Over the months that followed, the abuse continued. Emily became an expert at building invisible armor. She excelled in school, not because she was trying to succeed, but because school was the one place where she could disappear into something that had nothing to do with home. She drew constantly, filling sketchbooks with detailed illustrations of forests, oceans, faraway places. She became quiet in ways her teachers noticed but could not quite name. Her art teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, wrote a note in her file that said, "Emily seems withdrawn lately. Check in." Nobody followed up. These small missed signals would be discussed later, at length, by people who wished they had looked closer. But in the moment, life moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to what was happening behind the closed doors of an ordinary house on Maple Creek Drive. Emily stopped confiding in friends. She stopped going to birthday parties. She made excuses to avoid sleepovers. Part of this was because she was afraid of letting anything slip. Part of it was because she no longer felt like the same person who had once laughed easily and talked without guarding every word. She felt hollowed out. She felt like she was watching her own life from slightly outside her body. She started having nightmares. She started losing weight. She started flinching at sounds, a door closing too fast, footsteps on stairs,
a voice raised even slightly. Her mother noticed these things. Sandra asked again if Emily was okay, and Emily said yes again, and this time the yes came out so flat and so automatic that Sandra paused for a moment.
But Kelvin was in the next room, and Emily's eyes flicked toward the wall, and Sandra didn't push. She told herself it was just teenage stuff. She told herself Emily was adjusting. She told herself she would keep watching. She didn't know that by the time she finally saw clearly, the wound would already be very deep. There is a question that people often ask when they hear stories like this. Why didn't she just tell someone? And I want to pause here and speak to that question directly, because it matters. Emily didn't tell because she was 14 years old and living in a home with a man who had methodically dismantled her sense of what was safe and what was real. She didn't tell because she had spent her whole life watching her mother fight to keep them afloat, and the thought of being the reason that everything fell apart again was more than she could bear. She didn't tell because abuse does not announce itself as something you can simply report and have taken care of. It whispers, it convinces, it makes the victim responsible for the secret. Emily was not weak. Emily was not a child who failed to speak up. Emily was a child who was trapped. And if you are watching this and you know a child who has gone quiet, who has pulled away, who seems to be carrying something they can't put into words, please pay attention. Because sometimes, silence is the loudest cry for help there is.
If the story is already touching you, please hit the like button so more people can hear this message. Awareness saves lives. And before we continue, how would you feel if this were your daughter, your sister, your niece? Leave your thought in the comments because this conversation matters.